The Black Ship. Penitent's Grace settles into Luna's receiving dock, Tertius, with the mechanical precision of a funeral rite. Its void-scored hull bears no heraldry, only serial numbers that identify it as one of 47 vessels scheduled for this cycle's harvest. Through reinforced viewports, dock workers observe the familiar ritual of debarkation. The manifest lists cargo in sanitized terms: 312 units for immediate processing, 17 for extended evaluation. The units have names once. They had families, the small dreams that make existence bearable. Now they are entries in a ledger, awaiting what the administratum calls translation to the light. The processing begins before the ship's engines finish their death rattle cooling. Servo skulls drift through umbilical corridors, updating manifests in real time. Behind blast doors, the quiet rooms wait in sterile anticipation. The name itself is bureaucratic poetry. These chambers are neither quiet nor rooms in any meaningful sense. They are sorting facilities, designed with the same industrial efficiency that processes grain or manufactures bolter shells. The difference is that grain does not weep. At a high lectern beneath a flickering lumen rune, Clerk Jorik performs his inherited duty. His family has served in this capacity for 6 generations, each learning the rhythm of the stamp, the weight of the seal. The forms he processes bear the header, translation to the light, logistics sheets, not prayer cards. He reads columns by touch more than sight, intake code, provenance, psychic index, disposition. A servo skull floats the inkwell to his hand when the stamp dries. He does not look up when Sisters of Silence pass, their presence dragging the air cold. He does not look up when a child says "mother" in a language he does not recognize. He stamps. The ink bleeds slightly. Translated. Through bulletproof glass, tech adepts thread cables into the hands of the chosen, murmuring the litany of illumination. The cadence is familiar and wrong. It begins like a hymn and resolves like a checklist. Intake stable at 30 lumens. Flux within sanctioned range. Align the conduits, seal the manifold, banish the name, sustain the lumen, feed the light, watch the gauge, purge the strain. The adepts tap each phrase on conduit casings as they speak, knuckles counting beats like maintenance steps. Once, these words appeared in Technical Manual Theta IX, filed under Psychic Conductivity Optimization Protocols. The migration from engineering document to sacred text occurred during the 3rd millennium, when direct language proved too uncomfortable for institutional memory. The numbers are not secret, merely unremarked. Terra's receiving stations maintain steady state, approximately 1,000 souls per day translated into useful burn, with buffers for festival tides and campaign surges. The dockmaster's register shows the rhythm. 50 here, 100 there, entire. Holds when the Shola's harvests exceed projections. Some cycles climb to 1,100, others drop to 980, requiring emergency requisitions to balance the ledgers. There is comfort in arithmetic. The Astronomicon neither brightens nor dims to the layman's eye, but navigators feel fluctuations in their bones and file quiet, unsent memos documenting the correlation. We found an early litany fragment etched into a data slate spine in a Mechanicus annex, rubricated as STC illumination subroutine. Maintain beacon output between sanctioned bounds. Prevent feedback through reverse polarity rapids. Never break the circle while current flows. Centuries of ecclesiarchy interpolation sanded the edges and inserted virtue where procedure once lived. A line becomes a tone, Seal becomes sanctify. Purge becomes purify. It remains efficient propaganda because it remains technically accurate. If the sequence fails, something important dies. The institutions here do not meet in secret rooms to plot. They do not need to. The Adeptus Astronomica posts requisitions as lightless numbers that move ships. The Mechanicus files maintenance prayers that read like patch notes. The Imperial cult teaches citizens to kiss the stamp's mark, because it means their suffering is accounted, therefore meaningful. The custodes stand behind glass, heavy with gold and silence, ensuring meaning never becomes question. None could survive a world where the ledger stopped. We call it conspiracy, for lack of better terminology. The better word is function. The Emperor's darkest secret does not hide behind sealed doors. It lives in throughput tables, in hands that connect cables in identical sequences at identical hours, in the way stamps hit paper and bleed. A machine of hunger operates here, feeding an absence shaped by purpose. A wound he opened, pursuing a future he did not finish. There is a road beneath the palace that was meant to lead elsewhere, away from the storm, and a breach where the road failed. What wound beneath terror requires this daily tithe in human light? Why does the prayer that feeds it read like a manual written by someone who knew exactly which switches to flip? The 1,000 souls that burn each day in terror's quiet rooms are not feeding a god. They are feeding a wound, a catastrophic breach in reality that was never meant to exist. To understand why the Emperor's light demands such constant fuel, we must examine what he was building when the light began to fail. Beneath the Imperial Palace lies the shattered remnant of humanity's stolen future. A network of tunnels punched through the webway itself, intended to free our species from the very forces that now demand daily sacrifice. The Emperor's grand design was not conquest, but construction. While his gene sons claimed worlds in his name, he carved passages through dimensions the Eldar had traveled for millions of years. This was to be humanity's own webway network, a transportation grid that would render the warp obsolete. Ships would move through clean corridors of folded space at engine speed, not drifting on probability currents through the sea of souls. Messages would slide along hard-walled conduits without burning astropath minds. Colonies would not vanish in translation storms. The Great Crusade could expand without the silent attrition of psyker death and demon predation. Construction began in the deepest catacombs beneath the Himalaya, where archaeotech machinery hummed through shifts measured in centuries. The scale defied comprehension. Portal configurations followed hexagonal matrices, each junction requiring 6 anchor points to distribute dimensional stress into prepared counter-realities. At every node, psychic resonance dampeners thrummed at frequencies calibrated to human neural patterns, drowning ambient warp noise the way breakwaters blunt ocean swells. The technology was not inherited but stolen, reverse-engineered from Eldar principles, and adapted for human physiology. The Golden Throne was not built as life support. It rose from a sunken dais as the master control nexus for the entire network, a psychic amplification device designed to allow its operator to monitor and direct traffic across thousands of tunnel routes simultaneously. The Emperor intended to sit upon that throne as humanity's eternal navigator, guiding ships through passages that existed outside normal space and time. It was a helm, not a deathbed. His methodology followed established patterns, build tools for specific purposes, then dispose of them when they become liabilities. The Thunder Warriors had served their function during unification, then became genetic hazards requiring elimination. The Primarchs represented the next iteration, stable project managers designed to oversee webway construction in distant sectors. Each possessed facets of the project's requirements. Dawn would fortify access points, others would patrol the tunnels, hunting anything that seeped where it did not belong. The legions served as tunnel security, establishing waystation defenses and clearing routes of warp spawn. Timeline fragments suggest preparation spanning millennia. During the Age of Strife, while humanity cowered from Psyker storms, the Emperor had already begun preliminary excavations. The Great Crusade provided cover and resources. Fleets carried not just conquest forces, but mobile construction crews, archaeotech boring equipment, and psychic dampening arrays to establish webway access points on every compliant world. Entire Mechanicus Forge worlds devoted their output to producing hexagonal portal frames. Among all his gene sons, Magnus the Red possessed the psychic sensitivity necessary to serve as the webway's primary operator. While his brothers conquered worlds, Magnus was being prepared for the Golden Throne itself, where his consciousness would extend through humanity's new road network. The Emperor's greatest psychic son would become the eternal navigator for passages that required no conventional navigation, his mind interfacing with systems designed to respond to Primarch-grade cognition. The vision carried terrible implications for existing institutions. Navigator houses would lose their monopoly on warp travel. Astropath networks would become redundant. The Mechanicus would see their archaeotech hoarding challenged by mass-produced portal technology. Even the Space Marine legions might find diminished purpose in a galaxy where expansion no longer required military conquest of hostile warp routes. The Emperor had always been willing to discard obsolete tools, but tools sometimes develop survival instincts. The question remains what specific vulnerabilities he failed to anticipate in a project requiring absolute loyalty from minds designed to think independently. How did Magnus, the chosen guardian of humanity's stolen future, become central to the webway's operation, and ultimately to its catastrophic failure? The Emperor's chosen guardian for humanity's stolen roads was never meant to be a destroyer. Magnus the Red represented the culmination of 30 millennia of planning, a living interface designed to merge consciousness with the webway's dimensional matrices. While his gene brothers conquered worlds to feed the Great Crusade's expansion, Magnus received education of a different order entirely. In the deepest chambers beneath the palace, where prototype portal arrays hummed, with barely contained energies, the Emperor personally guided his red-skinned son through exercises in psychic resonance and dimensional perception. The curriculum was engineering disguised as mysticism. Magnus learned to read pressure differentials in unreality, to thread consciousness through hexagonal portal configurations without destabilizing their anchor points, to sense when psychic resonance dampeners required recalibration. Each lesson built toward the ultimate purpose. Magnus would sit upon the Golden Throne as humanity's eternal navigator, his consciousness expanding through the network like neural impulses through synapses, monitoring traffic and maintaining dimensional stability across thousands of routes simultaneously. But the education required partners no human psyker could provide. Training with Primarch-grade abilities burned out normal neural pathways within moments. The Emperor introduced Magnus to entities from the Warp, who presented themselves as teachers of ancient wisdom. They appeared as geometric patterns of living mathematics, speaking in harmonic frequencies that resonated with Magnus's scholarly nature. They called themselves by concept names: the Architect of Understanding, the Keeper of Forbidden Paths, the One who whispers solutions. They never demanded worship, only curiosity. Under their tutelage, Magnus learned to amplify his reach beyond designed limits, to perceive dimensional structures invisible to lesser minds, to fold space with efficiency that impressed even his father. The entities taught him shortcuts through the Warp's chaotic currents, methods to reinforce portal matrices against dimensional stress, techniques to sense intrusions before they manifested. Magnus believed them benevolent advisors, cataloguing their gifts as phenomena he might have discovered independently given sufficient time. He accepted favors confidently, certain he remained in command, because he understood the exchange. The bill would arrive in currency he had never learned to price. The Webway project demanded absolute compartmentalization. Magnus alone among the Primarchs knew the complete vision. Not simple conquest, but infrastructure development. Not empire, but escape route. He carried this knowledge as sacred trust, understanding that premature disclosure could doom the project to sabotage by institutions whose power depended on Warp travel's continued necessity. The Navigator houses, astropath networks, even the Mechanicus, all would resist technology that rendered their monopolies obsolete. Then came the moment that shattered 30 millennia of preparation. Through scrying techniques his teachers had perfected, Magnus detected corruption spreading through Horus, like infection through flesh. The War Master's fall was not gradual decline, but sudden invasion, his mind colonized by entities that smiled while devouring. Magnus watched in horror as his brother began converting entire legions, planning rebellion, while the Emperor celebrated victory on distant Ulanor, surrounded by triumph, while treachery festered in his absence. The choice appeared simple. Normal communication would require months through astropath networks already compromised by growing warp storms. By then, Horus's corruption might spread beyond containment. The Emperor needed immediate warning, delivered with certainty that no intermediary could provide. Magnus chose loyalty over protocol. He would project his consciousness directly across the galaxy, using techniques his warp teachers had shown him, punching through every barrier between him and his father. His desperate message struck the Webway's protective systems like artillery through crystal. The palace's nested wards, layers of null cairns, psychic baffles tuned to the network's frequencies, hexed geometry, designed to bend intrusive thought into harmless circles, shattered under Magnus's psychic scream. Resonance dampeners failed in cascade patterns. Hexagonal anchor rings flickered out of phase as dimensional stress exceeded all design parameters. Portal matrices warped into configurations they had never been built to bear. Below, in tunnels that existed outside normal space-time, reality buckled. Pressure waves raced along clean corridors and made them dirty. Where the lattice thinned, something noticed. Demons poured through the weakened roots like floodwater finding cracks, not yet into terror proper, but into the almost terror the Emperor had carved beneath it. Magnus's teachers revealed their true nature as his warning tore holes they could finally exploit. The Emperor's response was immediate and devastating. He abandoned Ulanor's celebrations, leaving triumph incomplete to race back to Terra. The Golden Throne's purpose changed in hours from control nexus to containment system. Tech adepts tore open housings never meant to be touched, rerouted conduction channels from traffic management to brute force projection, wired auxiliary feed lines that transformed metaphor into literal consumption. The first black ship quotas doubled without proclamation. The Litany of Illumination acquired new verses that did not rhyme. Increase output to sanctioned overdraw. Maintain circle integrity. Deny reverse flow at all costs. Magnus had acted in perfect loyalty. His warning reached its target, delivered with precision his teachers had enabled. But loyalty married to urgency became sabotage. The future he was trained to shepherd, ships moving cleanly, minds speaking without burning, collapsed into a present where minds burn daily to seal what his devotion had broken. What was the true scale of the daemonic incursion that Magnus's desperate loyalty unleashed beneath Terra itself? How did the Emperor initially attempt damage control when his greatest project became his greatest threat? The damage assessment began within hours of Magnus's breach, but assessment assumes the possibility of repair. What the Emperor's most trusted son had unleashed beneath Terra was not a tactical setback, but a dimensional hemorrhage, reality bleeding into unreality along fault lines that stretched through the palace's deepest foundations. While the Horus heresy consumed the galaxy above, humanity's true apocalypse unfolded in passages that existed between dimensions, where impossible geometry became killing ground, and the Emperor's golden host fought an enemy that should never have found purchase in clean space. The webway's hexagonal perfection became a tactical nightmare. Corridors designed for smooth dimensional transit created perfect ambush points where Guardian spears found no cover against entities that attacked from directions human spatial reasoning could not pass. Junctions flickered between configurations, 6 anchor points becoming 7, then 3, then arrangements that violated mathematical principles while remaining structurally sound. Combat reports from Captain General Voldor's sealed archives describe custodians learning to fight blind, relying on Sisters of Silence to navigate spaces where observation meant contamination. The daemons manifested not as individual entities, but as violations of physics given hunger. Living angles cut through auramite armor. Mathematical concepts devoured thoughts. Fractal patterns replicated through observer perception, forcing the custodians to develop combat techniques based on ritual rather than sight. Time made unreliable promises in those passages. Squads that fought for minutes returned with beards and shaking hands. Others deployed for hours and returned between heartbeats, armor smoking with temporal frost. The sisters' null presence created islands of stable reality, but the islands shrank daily as the ocean of corruption expanded. The Emperor descended into this war, not as distant commander, but as primary combatant. From the hastily converted Golden Throne, he projected his consciousness into the deepest breaches, wielding psychic force not as weapon, but as architectural tool, rebuilding dimensional walls that daemons dissolved faster than human minds could comprehend. Each intervention cost him measurably. Throne chamber auspex recorded temperature spikes in the core vaults, sympathetic resonance cascades, seizures in lesser psychers across Terra as their minds echoed his exertions. Before his corruption claimed him entirely, Apothecary Fabius of the Third Legion compiled restricted medical observations that read like prophecy, written in clinical language. His notes documented cellular degradation patterns, unlike anything in Imperial archives. Neural pathways showed burn scarring from psychic overload. Muscle tissue displayed crystalline deposits where warp energy had condensed into physical matter. Most disturbing were temporal anomalies, cells aging at different rates, some regenerating backwards, others locked in decay cycles that repeated without resolution. Fabius recorded seizures lasting exactly 43 minutes and 11 seconds, recurring every 6 hours with mechanical precision. During these episodes, the Emperor's consciousness departed his physical form entirely, manifesting as pure psychic force in webway chambers where conventional matter could not survive dimensional pressure. His body remained functional but empty, breathing through autonomic processes, while his mind fought wars in spaces that existed only when observed. Cross-reference those medical signatures with throne chamber readings, and you trace the Emperor's decline in hard numbers. He was dying before Horus ever raised a weapon. The Mechanicus response escalated through increasingly desperate measures. Tec Dominus Malcador authorized demon-proof bulkheads using blessed adamantium and hexagrammic script, but materials proved insufficient against entities that existed as concepts rather than physical forms. Psychic dampening fields required constant recalibration as demon frequencies shifted to match their harmonics. Automated defense systems triggered on motion and electromagnetic signatures, but demons manifested as violations of physics that sensors could not pass. Each technological solution failed along predictable curves. Bulkheads held until demons found resonant frequencies that made blessed metal sing itself apart. Dampeners muted the warp until the warp learned to whisper between pulses. Rotary guns spat consecrated ammunition at phenomena that did not understand momentum until it unmade them. The Mechanicus achieved only time bought in difficult minutes, shape imposed on chaos through constant vigilance. Victory belonged to other wars. Here, the only meaningful metric was whether the door to Terra stayed closed. The objective crystallized through bitter experience. Containment, not victory, represented the only achievable goal. The webway's dimensional anchor, points throughout Terra, began failing in sequence, each collapse threatening new breach sites across the planet's surface. Evacuation plans were drafted, then abandoned, when it became clear that fleeing would only spread contamination. The Emperor made the calculation that would define 10 millennia: seal what could be sealed, feed what must be fed, hold the line at any cost. Power requirements exceeded all projections. Emergency requisitions doubled black ship quotas, then tripled them as dimensional stress continued mounting. The Litany of Illumination acquired new verses written in tech-adept binary. Increase output to sanctioned overdraw, maintain circle integrity, deny reverse flow at all costs. The clinical language migrated into sacred text, because precision mattered more than poetry when reality hung by threads. By the war's end, Fabius's final assessment documented systemic failures across multiple organ systems. Neurological pathways had been rerouted so many times that normal thought required conscious effort. Cellular regeneration had become dependent on external psychic input. Without constant warp energy infusion, the Emperor's body would begin dying within hours. The Golden Throne's conversion from navigation nexus to life support was not preparation for future wounds, but response to existing damage. The irony completed itself with mathematical certainty. Magnus's desperate warning had reached its target, but receiving it had crippled the receiver. When Horus finally struck his killing blow, he would be delivering death to someone who had been slowly dying for years, sustained only by the same energies that had destroyed his greatest work. How severe was the Emperor's physical decline before Horus wounded him? What emergency measures were implemented to maintain his deteriorating form as the webway consumed his very essence? The medical ledgers from the webway warstrip mythology to mechanism. Cross-referencing Fabius's restricted assessments with throne chamber telemetry reveals the truth Imperial doctrine cannot acknowledge. The Emperor's body was failing before Horus ever raised Worldbreaker. Cellular degradation cascaded through neural pathways, burned thin by sustained psychic projection. Organ crystallization progressed as warp exposure converted living tissue into something between flesh and mineral. The throne battle delivered killing blows to a form already dying by degrees, sustained only through emergency measures that had converted humanity's greatest technological achievement into desperate life support. The conversion crisis began during the webway's collapse, when the Emperor's consciousness spent increasing time projected into dimensional breach points, while his body remained anchored to failing systems. Initially, brief excursions posed manageable risk, but contaminated dimensional feedback created neural burn patterns that accumulated faster than regeneration could repair. Each psychic intervention left scar tissue in his brain. Each dimensional seal required cellular energy his metabolism could no longer replace through normal consumption. Tech Dominus Arcan Land's sealed archives document the improvised modifications with clinical precision. The Golden Throne's psychic conduits, designed to route webway traffic through hexagonal portal matrices, underwent emergency rerouting within days of Magnus's breach. Master control noospheres were bridged to crude biofeedback loops. Navigation interfaces became neural extension cables. The original purpose, traffic supervision across clean corridors, was gutted to prioritize two grim functions: anchor the breach and keep the operator alive long enough to repeat the process. Biological maintenance systems followed similar patterns of desperate escalation. Autoventricular pumps were sutured into the Emperor's great vessels when psychic excursions left his heart pausing between realities. Chemostatic dialysis lattices scrubbed metabolites no human physiology should produce, including crystalline residues catalogued as warp precipitates. Nutrient feeds required constant adjustment, as temporal drift meant substances nourishing at dawn might poison by dusk if local time had shifted under dimensional stress. The Psyker feeding mechanism represented the conversion's ugliest necessity. Auxiliary galleries were bored into vault walls to accept the quiet room's output directly. Psychoreactive capacitors translated harvested consciousness into spectra the throne could metabolize. What began as temporary measure, condemned criminals drained to extend projection range, escalated through volunteers to conscripts to the 1,000-soul daily quotas that maintain baseline function. Sisters of Silence stood watch to prevent resonance feedback from imprinting dying faces on chamber walls. It happened anyway. These modifications shared a critical flaw. They were emergency measures, not engineered solutions. The Golden Throne had been constructed over millennia using Archaeotech principles the Mechanicus understood only partially. Core components operated through dimensional mechanics that predated Imperial science, relying on inherited rather than developed technologies. When crisis demanded rapid modification, tech priests worked through trial and error, installing systems that functioned without comprehension of operational parameters. Component failure rates accelerated under improvised load. Psychic conduits designed for single-user navigation began burning out under multi-user drain. Power distribution networks suffered cascade failures when demand exceeded design capacity. Each repair required cannibalizing components from other systems, creating new vulnerabilities that demanded further improvisation. Mean time between failures trended in directions that made optimistic projections impossible. The Mechanicus established maintenance protocols based on observation rather than understanding. Tech priests learned to recognize warning signs, temperature fluctuations in specific housings, harmonic variations in dampening fields, color changes in nutrient feeds, without comprehending underlying causes. They developed ritual responses to each symptom, following procedures that worked without knowing why. The litany of illumination became operational checklist disguised as prayer, because precision mattered more than comprehension when systems failed faster than knowledge accumulated. Nothing about this configuration is elegant. The Golden Throne as it exists is improvised emergency apparatus lashed onto Archaeotech foundations, only partly understood. Certain components refuse replication. Gravitic inverters labeled in scripts older than Mars, null cairns that lose efficacy when copied, core manifolds that punish improper prayer with capacitor flashover. Replacement capacity trails degradation by percentages that compound annually. By the Webway War's end, medical assessment revealed final irony. Horus struck someone already dead in every meaningful sense. The Emperor's consciousness persisted only through mechanical extension, his body maintained only through artificial intervention, his authority sustained only through institutional amnesia about emergency measures that kept him functional. The conversion established patterns defining 10 millennia. Emergency became standard procedure. Desperate improvisation became sacred ritual. Mechanical failure became divine mystery, requiring faith rather than understanding. What are the throne's multiple, hidden functions beyond life support that strain its failing components? How do tech priests maintain systems they don't fully comprehend, while component failure rates continue accelerating? The failing systems beneath the palace require fuel measured in human consciousness, and the Astronomicon serves as both cover and engine for this consumption. What presents itself to the galaxy as divine beacon, the Emperor's light guiding ships through warp storms, operates as an active projection system, a pump that inhales souls and exhales navigational fire. The light does not shine passively from Terra's throne room. It burns, consuming psyche consciousness at industrial rates to maintain output levels that keep 1,000,000 worlds connected through the sea of souls. The system operates on 2 interlocked circuits that trade strength in moments never recorded in public archives. Primary flow channels power to the Webway breach beneath Terra, sealing dimensional fractures that threaten to consume the planet itself. Secondary flow projects the Astronomican's beacon across galactic distances, penetrating warp storms with sufficient intensity to guide navigator houses through passages that would otherwise consume entire fleets. When the breach surges, the beacon falters. When navigation demands increase, containment draws thin. The balance exists as a line walked daily over a chasm by institutions that have learned to call their terror devotion. Blackship harvest routes follow carefully calculated patterns coordinated through Adeptus Astra Telepathica, shipping manifests that read like grain requisitions but traffic in harvested mines. Fleet Tertius covers segmentum solar core worlds on 18-month cycles, processing approximately 40,000 units per rotation. Fleet Secundus works outer rim territories with higher yield ratios, as frontier populations produce more untrained psychers per capita than civilized worlds where detection leads to early removal. Fleet Primus handles emergency requisitions and specialized collections, including dangerous cases requiring immediate extraction from populated areas. Processing begins the moment cargo bay doors seal. Triage systems sort incoming shipments by psychic index and stability ratings through protocols refined over millennia of industrial efficiency. The weak, children whose abilities manifest as uncontrolled emotion bleeding, adults whose minds fracture under minimal pressure, receive marks etched in oil and salt before feeding directly into throne auxiliary systems through the quiet rooms. Their consciousness burns clean, providing steady baseline power without dangerous resonance effects that might destabilize containment protocols. The strong undergo different processing. Psychers with stable manifestations and measurable control face soul-binding rituals that kill half and blind most survivors, emerging as astropaths whose voices link to the throne through shared agony. These represent investment rather than immediate consumption. Trained astropaths serve for decades before neural degradation requires replacement. The dangerous cases face immediate execution, their abilities too volatile for any constructive application. Servo skulls incinerate remains while recording psychic discharge patterns for future reference and threat assessment. Quota escalation documents the hidden story of systemic failure. Early post-heresy records indicate daily consumption of approximately 400 souls for baseline Astronomican function. Current requirements exceed 1,000 daily, with projections indicating 5% annual increases as throne efficiency degrades and dimensional stress compounds. Emergency protocols exist for surge demands during warp storm seasons or major fleet movements, when beacon output must increase to penetrate dimensional interference. These Solis Red events require entire black ship cargoes burned simultaneously, consuming months of harvest in hours to prevent navigation blackouts navigators call nightfall. The bureaucratic machinery operates with logistics precision that would impress any Munitorum quartermaster trafficking in ammunition rather than consciousness. Manifest forms track cargo by psychic index, stability rating, and estimated burn duration. Quality control measures ensure consistent product through protocols administered by Sisters of Silence, whose null presence screens for contamination while preventing resonance feedback from imprinting dying faces on chamber walls. Emergency requisition protocols activate when worlds fail quotas, triggering immediate collection sweeps that strip entire populations of psychic potential within standard months. Official documentation employs euphemisms that serve multiple institutional functions. Translation to the light, rather than execution, maintains morale among processing staff who might otherwise question their duties. Blessed service, rather than consumption, provides legal cover for operations that constitute systematic predation under any reasonable definition. Sacred offering, rather than industrial sacrifice, creates plausible mythology for populations that must accept regular harvests as divine necessity rather than institutional cannibalism. The hidden costs compound across generations in ways that threaten the system's sustainability. Worlds subjected to regular tithes show measurable declines in psychic manifestation rates as genetic potential is systematically removed from breeding populations. Frontier colonies report increasing difficulty maintaining astropath communications as local talent pools become depleted through overcollection. Some sectors face communications blackouts lasting standard years when harvest rates exceed replacement capacity, creating isolated regions where imperial authority exists only on paper filed in distant archives. Terror operates as institutional policy rather than accidental byproduct. Families teach children to suppress psychic manifestations through techniques passed in whispered traditions that become survival skills. Local authorities maintain quotas through denunciation systems, rewarding citizens for reporting suspected psychers, creating surveillance networks that turn communities against themselves. Black ship arrivals trigger population behaviors resembling natural disaster responses, evacuation attempts, hoarding, desperate marriages to produce children before harvest claims potential parents. Throne chamber telemetry reveals the mathematics of approaching collapse. Power draw increases annually while efficiency decreases, creating demand curves that intersect at impossible points within projected decades. Tech priests file sealed reports documenting component failures, requiring exponentially higher input to maintain equivalent output. The Astronomican's brightness remains constant to navigator perception, but maintaining that consistency demands fuel consumption that grows beyond sustainable collection rates, as underlying systems degrade faster than repair capacity. Managing increasing power requirements begins with redefining language itself. Overdraw ceases to be emergency protocol and becomes standard sacrament. Choirs once rested between broadcasts, now shifts overlap, and relief comes as coma rather than rotation. New capacitor banks crowd vault corridors, their housings stamped with reliquary seals to disguise batteries as bones. When demand spikes, cascade burns harmonize multiple choirs to single surges, multiple quiet rooms opening in parallel, so the throne can drink without choking on its meal. What happens when worlds cannot meet their quotas, and emergency sweeps find populations already stripped of psychic potential? How is the rising power requirement managed when projections indicate demand will exceed all possible supply within measurable timeframes? The mathematics of failure had been trending toward catastrophe for months, but emergency protocols normalized crisis until warning signs became routine noise. In Webway Sector Gamma 7, 17 levels beneath the throne chamber, fabricator Acolyte Kalen performed standard integrity assessments on barrier field generators that had operated without incident for 3 millennia. His diagnostic servitors registered parameters within sanctioned bounds: containment integrity at 97%, psychic resonance stable, dimensional anchor points locked across all measurement axes. The litany of illumination echoed through chamber vox casters in maintenance cadence, each verse marking successful system verification. Intake stable at 30 lumens, flux within sanctioned range. Align the conduits, seal the manifold, banish the name. The collapse arrived without transition. Ancient hexagrammic matrices that had contained Magnus's breach since the heresy simply ceased, their protective geometries dissolving like equations erased from a slate. Reality cracked along stress lines invisible to human perception, hairline fractures spreading through dimensional space with the sound of breaking glass magnified beyond endurance. Kalen's servitors shrieked as their optical sensors overloaded, Auspex readings climbing past measurement capacity before the displays went dark. Through widening fissures, entities that had spent 10 millennia studying the breach from the other side finally found purchase in clean space. The daemons manifested not as crude battlefield spawn, but as sophisticated predators, violations of physics given hunger and purpose. They unraveled Kalen's consciousness thread by thread, savoring each memory of sacred oil and whispered prayer before discarding the emptied shell. Custodian Valerius responded with protocols designed for combat in impossible geometry, his guardian's spear carving binding circles that gave unreality substance solid enough to kill. Sisters of Silence deployed through service corridors, their null presence creating islands of stable mathematics within an ocean of dimensional chaos. Emergency klaxons activated predetermined responses as blast doors sealed access routes and automated systems flooded breach-adjacent chambers with null field projectors. But the ancient barriers had not failed randomly. They collapsed following degradation curves that maintenance schedules should have detected decades earlier. Component replacement had fallen behind optimal parameters as archaeotech understanding diminished and supply chains stretched beyond sustainable capacity. From the Golden Throne, the Emperor felt dimensional pressure, building like blood behind a tourniquet. His consciousness departed his failing body without ceremony, projecting directly into the breach with psychic force that made the palace foundations shudder. Throne chamber medical telemetry registered immediate system fluctuations as life support power rerouted to combat applications. Cellular degradation accelerated beyond sustainable rates as he burned his own substance to fuel dimensional warfare, each intervention leaving measurable scar tissue in neural pathways already compromised by millennia of similar crises. Across the galaxy, the Astronomicon flickered as its fuel supply diverted to emergency containment. Navigator houses detected beacon disruption and began emergency calculations for possible system failure. A battle barge near Hydrafa cut engines and prayed, pilgrim convoys scattered to avoid collision as their masters trusted bloodlines to sense light that suddenly pulsed like a failing heart. The Emperor's intervention manifested as geometric impossibility, his psychic presence imposing human logic on spaces that operated by alien mathematics. Tech priests throughout affected levels performed final services through calculated sacrifice. When primary systems failed, Magos Dominus Zerion initiated manual overrides requiring direct neural interface with corrupted machinery, using his own sanity as firewall against entities seeking to possess Imperial technology. At Capacitor Bank K-17, another Magos bridged conductors with his augmetic spine when servos jammed, turning his body into a temporary buzzbar, while skin blistered from heat discharge. Similar sacrifices occurred at 17 critical nodes, as adepts chose death over allowing breach expansion beyond containment capacity. The crisis peaked when seismic sensors detected dimensional pressure, threatening Terra's geological stability. The breach extended downward through planetary strata, seeking connection with molten core that would provide unlimited energy for expansion. Crust samples showed crystalline formations existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, matter that had forgotten which reality it belonged to. If the breach reached magma chambers, Terra would become the first planet consumed from within by living violations of space-time. Resolution required unprecedented sacrifice. Fleet Primus had arrived at Luna with emergency cargo, nearly 3,000 souls collected during crisis sweeps from 3 sectors simultaneously. The entire shipment received immediate processing through parallel quiet room systems, never designed for simultaneous operation. Psycho-reactive capacitors overloaded as they translated harvested consciousness into spectra the throne could metabolize. The litany unified across 300 voxcasters until words became metronome and anesthetic. Sustain the lumen, feed the light, watch the gauge, purge the strain. The Emperor's projection blazed with borrowed power, his psychic presence expanding to encompass the entire breach network. Forced closure resembled surgery performed with nuclear fire, dimensional fractures sealed under pressure that made reality itself groan. Portal matrices snapped back into proper configuration, with harmonics that shattered crystal formations throughout the palace's lower levels. The breach collapsed upon itself, leaving scorched tunnels and the lingering taste of ozone mixed with something that might have been regret. Aftermath assessment revealed systemic institutional failure. Barrier fields had collapsed predictably rather than randomly, following degradation patterns maintenance protocols should have detected decades earlier. The post-action ledger read like shipyard inventory after a storm. Capacitor depletion at 89%, hexagrammic coatings ablated to base metal, choir attrition at 31%, with replacements requisitioned from sectors already in deficit. The Emperor's EEG showed stepwise degradation across multiple bands. Autonomic overrides engaged 6 hours longer than projected parameters. Most disturbing were the mathematical projections. If ancient systems could fail without warning after millennia of stable operation, similar failures might occur at any critical node throughout the containment network. Current black ship harvest rates could sustain perhaps 3 such crises annually before collection capacity fell behind consumption requirements. The litany acquired new verses that sounded like maintenance manuals with adjectives, and emergency became standard procedure, while the quiet rooms learned to open without orders. How many similar containment failures occur annually across Terra's compromised dimensional infrastructure? And what contingency plans exist if the breach cannot be contained and the planet faces consumption from within? The breach's containment required more than dimensional engineering. It demanded the systematic elimination of witnesses whose survival threatened operational security. Custodian Valerius sealed his helmet's voxcaster before entering Sector Gamma 7's scorched remains, where reality still bore scorch marks from the Emperor's desperate intervention. His mission parameters included standard breach assessment, casualty documentation, and witness management. The euphemisms translated to ensuring no one who had observed the master of mankind's failing struggle would survive to question what they had witnessed. The Adeptus Custodes maintain daily routines structured around truths too dangerous for institutional memory. Their shifts begin with throne system monitoring through terminals displaying data streams that would drive lesser minds to madness or rebellion. Neural activity patterns, cellular degradation rates, psychic resonance fluctuations, each measurement confirms what their conditioning allows them to acknowledge without emotional response. They watch the Emperor's chest rise under mechanical rhythm, observe micro-tremors ripple his fingers when his consciousness departs to wrestle dimensional pressure, and sign requisitions that will strip 5 worlds of psychers this cycle instead of 4. Watch officers sit before Auspex banks, tracking harmonic drift in the throne's conduits, every deviation greater than 1 part in 10,000 triggering silent alarms, and psalms recited in the old tongue that double as maintenance checklists. Patrols trace the warded steps along inner webway doors, tapping each seal ring with guardian spear butts to test resonance integrity. On the hour, a shield captain crosses the choir galleries, counting breaths, ensuring no singer has slipped into the kind of coma from which consciousness never returns. Between duties, they stand behind reinforced glass, watching the man they call Master of Mankind, while logging voltages that measure his decline in hard numbers. Their psychological conditioning operates through compartmentalization protocols installed during their creation process. Neural restructuring creates cognitive barriers that separate operational knowledge from emotional response, allowing them to observe institutional atrocity with clinical precision while maintaining absolute devotion to imperial authority. They cultivate memory palaces with locked rooms reserved for unacceptable truths, opening doors to conduct necessary work before sealing them without allowing contents to leak into corridors where sleep and sanity live. The conditioning renders contradictions survivable. The Emperor is divine, and he is dying. The system is necessary, and it is murder. Classified protocols recognize that even well-maintained machines produce dangerous sparks. When a menial collapses after seeing too much of the Emperor's face through suddenly unshielded lumen windows, Protocol Quietus applies. Removal to the dais of silence, memory scrub via electropsycho-induction and blank serum, reassignment to low sensory labor if cognition survives the process. When tech priests linger over failed components, whispering dangerous questions, how can a god degrade? Responsible custodians cite writ of compliance C-IX, granting immediate martyrdom with blades that never miss their target. Disposal teams burn augmetics separately to prevent psychic echo in corrupted metal. Information warfare extends beyond physical elimination to mythology maintenance, coordinated with other imperial institutions. They choreograph evidence of the Emperor's active blessing through scheduled surges timed to saints' feast days, controlled astronomican brightening during pilgrimage masses, selected plague remissions, declared miraculous when valves open, and conduits clear according to maintenance schedules. They remove the unscripted through gentle corrections. A confessor whose sermons flirt with sacrifice, arithmetic receives private visitation where golden giants suggest preaching mercy instead. The confessor weeps, convinced he has witnessed living saints. He has encountered professional liars who prefer not to be lying. Their private records, sealed in amber vaults beneath the Eternity Gate, betray different testimony entirely. Graphs etched into adamant track failure rates, climbing like hills no one can crest, updated with gravers rather than ink to prevent electronic compromise. Annotations note choir attrition curves, capacitor fatigue patterns, hexagrammic ablation rates. Marginal notations in careful script add sentences that matter. We are losing ground, but not today. Unsent letters accumulate in files labeled Apologia, written to no one. The Emperor, humanity, children executed for seeing wrong doors open at wrong moments. They are not confessions, but receipts documenting the cost of institutional survival. The custodians understand what other institutions refuse to acknowledge. Current operations represent emergency protocols, extended beyond sustainable limits. Their classified assessments project system failure within calculable timeframes, estimates clustering around scenarios too catastrophic for public disclosure. Component degradation exceeds replacement capacity. Power requirements increase annually while efficiency decreases. The mathematics trend toward inevitable collapse through multiple failure modes, threatening not just Terra, but Imperial civilization itself. Yet they maintain sacred mythology, while managing engineered suffering through techniques bordering on institutional schizophrenia. They teach pilgrims to venerate eternal vigilance while witnessing mechanical systems keeping corpses functional. They enforce doctrine about divine martyrdom while processing requisitions for 1,000-soul daily consumption, maintaining baseline operations. They guard humanity's holiest shrine, knowing it functions as an abattoir disguised as a temple, protecting species survival through comprehensive deception about Protector's true nature. Their unique burden manifests in behaviors other institutions mistake for religious devotion. Absolute ceremonial silence reflects operational security rather than reverence. They cannot speak without destroying faith that keeps the Imperium functional. Perfect discipline emerges from understanding that deviation might trigger discoveries shattering Imperial civilization. Personal logs reveal psychological costs, dreams where the Emperor speaks in machinery's voice, requesting forgiveness for choices, transforming salvation into systematic predation. Others document phantom burning sensations, sympathetic responses to agony their master endures through mechanisms they help maintain. In maintenance passages after crises, when child servants crouch behind coolant drums with hands over ears and eyes wide with rotting knowledge, custodians kneel so shadows will not frighten, ask for names, then perform the only kindness their office permits. Reports read, corridor cleared, sanitation complete. They stand longer than regulation allows before rejoining patrols, carrying receipts for necessary murders in locked rooms of carefully partitioned minds. What contingency plans do the custodians maintain for inevitable throne failure when graphs intersect the impossible and alarms never cease? How do warriors bred for truth and engineered for obedience survive knowledge that their sacred labor represents deception that must continue until mathematical certainty renders continuation impossible? The custodians' elimination protocols extend beyond physical termination to institutional coordination, where witness management becomes information architecture. The High Lords of Terra receive their briefings through filters calibrated by golden giants who transform failing voltages into acceptable policy language. Captain General Trajan Valoris chairs sessions where amber-sealed packets translate dimensional breach statistics into infrastructure stress assessments and soul consumption quotas into resource optimization parameters. Each High Lord operates within knowledge boundaries designed to preserve function while preventing comprehension that might paralyze decision-making. The Fabricator General receives technical specifications documenting component failure rates, power distribution anomalies, and archaeotech degradation patterns through reports scrubbed of context about power source origins. His archived assessments track accelerating system decay using euphemisms like fuel efficiency variance and input quality fluctuation that transform human consciousness into engineering variables. When capacitor banks require replacement using materials from 3 Forge Worlds' entire output, he approves requisitions without discussing what the capacitors actually capacitate. The Master of the Administratum manages black ship schedules, harvest quotas, and processing efficiency metrics through logistics frameworks that treat souls like grain shipments, requiring careful inventory management. The Ecclesiarch authorizes sacred rituals and pilgrimage programs that disguise industrial processes as divine mystery, maintaining popular faith through mythology that conceals mechanical reality. His theological assessments frame increasing power requirements as evidence of the Emperor's growing blessing, requiring greater devotional offerings from faithful populations. The Grand Master of Assassins maintains elimination protocols targeting dangerous knowledge, accumulation receiving automated target lists that provide operational parameters without explaining threat assessment criteria. His agents remove tech priests who ask uncomfortable questions and scribes whose records connect patterns better left unconnected. Resource allocation has become quiet civil war, fought through tithe percentages and budget footnotes. The Fabricator General pushes priority Sigma shipments of rare alloys and null cairn substrates to Terra, starving fleet refit schedules until battle fleets become ceremonial displays. The Master of the Astronomicon petitions for expanded harvest authority, converting emergency collection sweeps into routine practice, while populations learn to hide their children when ships approach. The Paternoval Envoy demands beacon stability guarantees. Responses arrive as prayers rather than promises. Administratum clerks rewrite edicts so identical numbers appear smaller, and worlds die by paperwork when grain margins become soul quotas. These debates mask deeper philosophical divisions over post-throne contingencies, classified planning scenarios that assume system failure without specifying mechanisms. The traditionalist faction, led by the Ecclesiarch and supported by conservative administratum elements, advocates maintaining current mythology indefinitely through enhanced propaganda campaigns and expanded saint veneration programs. They propose increased pilgrimage quotas and miracle scheduling to reinforce divine narrative against mounting evidence of mechanical reality, arguing that imperial faith can survive any crisis if properly managed. The pragmatist faction, centered around younger Mechanicus elements and efficiency specialists, argues for controlled disclosure programs, preparing imperial institutions for post-emperor governance. Their classified position papers suggest gradual revelation through carefully staged theological evolution, transforming divine sacrifice from active blessing to historical martyrdom while maintaining bureaucratic legitimacy through institutional rather than religious authority. They draft models showing initial unrest, followed by increased compliance once quotas are framed as patriotic offerings rather than sacred mystery. The militarist faction, represented by the Lord Commander Militant and certain Navy elements, advocates preparation for succession warfare and regional fragmentation, assuming Imperial unity cannot survive revelation of the Emperor's mortality. Their contingency planning focuses on maintaining core sector loyalty through military force while accepting periphery losses as inevitable consequence. They quietly stockpile resources and establish communication networks independent of astropath systems, preparing for scenarios where the Astronomicon fails and the Imperium fragments into competing successor states. Evidence of factional positions appears in sealed archives through documents never explicitly acknowledging their subject. Budget allocations for spiritual resilience programs fund propaganda campaigns, maintaining faith during such transitional periods. Personnel transfers labeled strategic redeployment position loyal officers, where succession conflicts might emerge. Session transcripts reveal psychological toll through speaking patterns that avoid dangerous topics by institutional habit, creating conversations dancing around central issues without approaching direct acknowledgement. The Captain General's private communications reveal growing concern about sustainability of current deception protocols. Mathematical projections indicate system failure will eventually force acknowledgement of truths currently managed through institutional amnesia. When component degradation exceeds replacement capacity, when harvest quotas cannot meet power requirements, when dimensional containment fails beyond repair, compartmentalization strategy will collapse under undeniable evidence. Minutes record decisions about resource allocation and strategic planning without documenting the underlying crisis driving all considerations, while High Lords develop cognitive habits preserving essential ignorance about implications of their necessary work. What specific post-throne contingencies are under consideration by factions preparing for inevitable system failure? And how would controlled disclosure of the Emperor's mortality affect Imperial stability across sectors where faith provides the only alternative to chaos? The High Lord's compartmentalized truth requires theological architecture capable of supporting political necessity, and the ecclesiarchy serves as chief architect of sacred deception, while the Captain General eliminates witnesses and the Fabricator General manages failing systems. The Adeptus Ministorum wages information warfare against humanity itself, transforming mechanical failure into spiritual mystery through doctrinal frameworks that explain divine silence as transcendent wisdom rather than neurological damage preventing conscious response. Ecclesiarch Deakis, 23, operates from briefings that arrive in amber seals bearing custodian authentication, documents that translate throne telemetry into theological language through euphemisms refined over millennia. Cellular degradation becomes divine contemplation requiring deeper communion. Power fluctuations become sacred breathing patterns of eternal meditation. Emergency soul consumption becomes increased blessing distribution to faithful populations. His archived sermons demonstrate that masterful theological gymnastics, explaining the Emperor's immobility as eternal vigil, and his silence as profound contemplation that guides the galaxy through pure will rather than spoken word. The Ministorum's training programs acknowledge deception as sacred duty through curricula that separate operational knowledge from emotional response. Advanced seminarians study courses labeled pastoral psychology that teach techniques for maintaining conviction while preaching known falsehoods. They learn to compartmentalize truth into categories of necessary knowledge versus dangerous understanding, developing cognitive habits that preserve faith through deliberate ignorance. Outer seminary priests receive finished hymnals with tidy stories of saints who bled on schedule. Inner seminary cadres learn the art of omission, translating engineering crises into seasonal fasts, escorting pilgrim crowds past shuttered reliquaries, while explaining that veils heighten revelation. These training differences create institutional schisms between those who know truth and those who genuinely believe propaganda. Cardinal Voss of Segmentum Solar maintains private correspondence documenting his psychological struggle with blessing pilgrims for journeys to terror, while knowing they worship a corpse sustained by industrial murder. Opposing him, Cardinal Matthias of Hydrafor demonstrates genuine faith in imperial divinity, his sermons carrying conviction that converts thousands because he believes every word about eternal vigilance and active blessing. Between them exist quiet wars fought through pastoral assignments and doctrinal emphasis, where confessors who count souls too openly receive frontier transfers, and preachers who weep after glimpsing maintenance crucifixes find themselves subjects of loyalty reviews. Canonization operates as managed industry, coordinated with other imperial institutions. The Office of Holy Verification maintains miracle calendars that track with maintenance windows, elevating the right corpse at the right hour, so beacon surges coincide with saints' feast days across multiple sectors. St. Euphrates' healing miracles correlate with scheduled Medicae shipments. St. Dolan's battlefield appearances align with Officio Assassinorum deployment schedules. Regional bishops receive quotas for spiritual events distributed across calendar years, ensuring steady flow of divine evidence without clustering that might suggest artificial management. The Divisio Miraculum vets unscripted miracles, suppressing those that contradict approved narratives, while amplifying events that reinforce faith in active divine intervention. The most sensitive development involves contingency planning for maintaining religious control if the emperor's death becomes undeniable. Project Phoenix outlines multi-stage theological evolution designed to survive revelation of mortality while preserving institutional authority. The eternal sacrifice doctrine frames the emperor's death as ultimate martyrdom, continuing to protect humanity through spiritual rather than physical presence. The divine ascension framework suggests his consciousness has transcended mortal shell, maintaining active blessing through pure spirit, unbound by flesh. These contingency theologies require gradual preparation through doctrinal shifts that emphasize spiritual presence and transcendent sacrifice in ways that could support either living divinity or posthumous veneration, depending on circumstances. Seminary curricula introduce these concepts through theological discussions that appear academic rather than operational. Sermons incorporate language about eternal vigilance and undying devotion that maintains ambiguity about physical versus spiritual existence. Material measures pair with theology. Shroud protocols would seal the sanctum indefinitely while proclaiming eternal wake, rationing access to empty presence in exchange for compliance. Relic economies would expand overnight, distributing bone, robe, ash, and dust, certified by sigil, and priced in obedience. Internal Ministorum documents reveal psychological costs of comprehensive deception. Confessional records from senior clergy document recurring nightmares about preaching to empty cathedrals, guilt over blessing children destined for soul harvest, and crises of faith in institutions demanding faith in known falsehoods. Some develop theological rationalizations, framing deception as divine commandment, arguing that protecting humanity from unbearable truth represents the emperor's final instruction. Others seek frontier transfers, where ignorance remains possible, and conviction can exist without institutional knowledge corroding faith from within. The ecclesiarchy's most dangerous secret is not the emperor's mortality, but their certainty that revelation would destroy imperial civilization. Their survival depends not on truth winning or losing, but on making meaning cheaper to acquire than doubt. As systems fail, they intend to flood the market with portable altars and rationed holiness, converting death into doctrine without collapsing the only story keeping humanity from tearing itself apart. How would the imperial cult survive revelation of the emperor's mortality when sacral authority rests on perceived divine endurance? What theological justifications are being prepared to maintain religious control after the central figure of worship becomes undeniably deceased? While the ecclesiarchy constructs theological frameworks to survive revelation, the Adeptus Mechanicus confronts harder mathematics entirely. Their proximity to the Golden Throne's failing systems transforms them from faithful servants into reluctant conspirators whose technical knowledge drives them toward humanity's ultimate heresy, preparing to replace the God Emperor with pure machine. They maintain his life support, and therefore understand what others cannot acknowledge. The Emperor is not divine, because divinity does not require constant mechanical intervention to prevent cardiac arrest. Fabricator General Kroll's sealed data vaults contain clinical assessments stripped of religious language, documenting component degradation through metrics that translate divine mystery into engineering failure. Psychic conduits show metal fatigue beyond material science parameters. Core manifolds display crystalline fractures that compound. Annually, power distribution networks operate at thermal limits approaching cascade failure, regardless of fuel availability. The Litany of Illumination, now Sacred Hymn, began as emergency override sequence, brute force commands bypassing failed circuits through psychic input when automated systems could no longer maintain baseline function. Their technical assessment carries unambiguous implications. The Golden Throne will fail through mechanical breakdown, independent of theological or political considerations. This certainty drives classified research programs, representing the Mechanicus's deepest institutional violation, developing technological alternatives that perform equivalent functions without requiring divine intervention or industrial soul consumption. Project Lux Eterna operates from Forge World Lucius through facilities officially designated Archaeotech Preservation Laboratories, while functioning as development centers for throne replacement technology. Tech Dominus Sigma 7 leads research into psychic amplification matrices, achieving beacon output at 12% current efficiency, using conventional power sources rather than harvested consciousness. Parallel programs investigate artificial intelligence solutions that violate fundamental Mechanicus doctrine while addressing operational necessity, synthetic minds capable of dimensional manipulation without succumbing to chaos corruption, reverse-engineered from the Emperor's neural activity patterns recorded through throne chamber data streams. These programs create institutional schisms between orthodox tech priests following established doctrine and pragmatists believing technological solutions must replace failing divine intervention. Magos Biologis Vex represents orthodox position through sealed communications, arguing that replacing the Emperor constitutes ultimate heresy, violating sacred trust between Mechanicus and throne. His faction maintains that technical problems require technical solutions within doctrinal boundaries, improved maintenance, better components, more efficient processing, rather than abandoning fundamental imperial authority principles. The pragmatist faction argues that doctrine must serve function rather than constraining it, framing replacement technology as fulfilling the Emperor's will through different means. They cite precedents where he discarded obsolete tools, thunder warriors, failed primarchs, entire populations, when superior alternatives became available. Their position papers develop what they term orthopraxy, correct doing rather than correct knowing, maintaining civilization through technological means regardless of theological orthodoxy. Secret facilities coordinate research through encrypted hymnal transmissions, appearing as routine liturgical broadcasts, sharing development across Forge worlds, Ryza, Metallica, and Graia. Their combined efforts focus on 3 replacement scenarios: technological, astronomican projection, synthetic consciousness interfaces, and hybrid systems, combining machine intelligence with limited biological components. Each approach requires materials and expertise, straining Mechanicus resources while violating multiple doctrinal prohibitions. The psychological costs of maintaining systems they recognize as unsustainable atrocity manifest in tech priest personal logs, documenting guilt over blessing machinery that consumes souls, horror at calculating optimal harvest rates for human consciousness, and growing certainty that sacred duty involves perpetuating systematic murder disguised as divine necessity. Some develop cognitive heresy, simultaneous devotion to the Emperor, and conviction that replacing him represents the most faithful possible service. Most dangerous are moderate voices arguing for gradual transition, maintaining current systems while secretly developing alternatives, preparing for inevitable failure without triggering institutional crisis through premature disclosure. They stockpile rare materials, train specialized personnel, and establish manufacturing capacity for technologies that may never receive official authorization until mathematical certainty renders authorization irrelevant. The Mechanicus's ultimate heresy transcends replacing the God Emperor with machine consciousness. They prepare comprehensive doctrinal violation while maintaining perfect loyalty to his memory and mission. Their internal documents reference Pattern Solis Ultima, a replacement throne coupling nullstone pylons, choir engines, and oracular manifolds into synthetic sovereignty that would not live but would decide, holding breaches shut and projecting beacons through algorithmic rather than divine authority. It represents engineering solution to theological problem, mathematical answer to mythological question. Somewhere test cells pulse in darkness, somewhere confessors bless breaker panels, and somewhere custodians compile elimination lists. The race accelerates between orthodoxy sharpening anathemas and pragmatists completing trials, while degradation curves intersect the impossible regardless of factional preference. What specific technological alternatives are being developed in facilities that officially do not exist? And how do orthodox and pragmatist factions resolve fundamental disagreements when both claim to serve the Emperor's wills through contradictory means that may determine humanity's survival? The Mechanicus factions wage theological war over replacement technologies, while fundamentally misunderstanding the system they seek to replace. Their debates assume the Golden Throne represents failing machinery, sustaining a dying victim, requiring technological salvation to preserve imperial function. But cross-referencing sealed data streams reveals a truth that renders their disputes irrelevant. The Emperor is not sustained by the throne's machinery. He operates it. His agony is not consequence of system failure, but deliberate choice, conscious, perpetual martyrdom engineered as humanity's salvation through systematic suffering. The evidence emerges through pattern recognition across institutional data that is hidden in plain sight for 10 millennia. Throne chamber telemetry shows neural activity spikes correlating not with life support fluctuations, but with dimensional pressure increases requiring additional containment force. During the Hydra 4 navigation crisis, beacon phase adjustments arrived 3 heartbeats before automated systems could calculate required changes. At Gamma 7's breach, micro-variations in containment pressure preceded custodian team deployment by margins impossible without conscious oversight. The mathematics reveal active rather than passive consciousness, someone watching, someone choosing, someone directing operations through will rather than automation. Decode the litany of illumination through its original technical context, and prayer reveals itself as operational manual, disguised through millennia of theological revision. Intake stable at 30 lumens documents psychic energy absorption rates measured in human consciousness. Flux within sanctioned range confirms dimensional stability parameters preventing breach expansion. Align the conduits, seal the manifold, banish the name, provides step-by-step instructions for processing harvested souls through psycho-reactive capacitors into spectra the throne can metabolize. The Emperor authored these commands as engineering protocols before institutional memory transformed them into sacred text, and he continues executing them through conscious will rather than automated systems. His divinity reveals itself as engineered functionality rather than supernatural blessing. The transformation from mortal ruler to psychic infrastructure required deliberate choice to become humanity's living engine of salvation, accepting eternal suffering as operational necessity. Every soul fed to the throne passes through his consciousness before conversion to useful energy. He experiences each death personally. Child psychers screaming for mothers who will never answer, sanctioned minds burning out in service corridors, entire black ship cargoes processed simultaneously during crisis surges. The agony accumulates without relief, because relief would mean system failure, and terror's consumption by entities probing dimensional barriers every moment of every day. The pattern that began with Thunder Warrior reaches ultimate expression through self-sacrifice. The Emperor built tools for specific purposes, then disposed of them when they became liabilities or obstacles to larger objectives. The Webway project failed, creating permanent breach requiring constant containment. The only tool capable of providing sufficient psychic force was the Emperor himself, transformed into conscious infrastructure through technology he had developed for different applications. He became the liability requiring disposal, but disposal meant accepting transformation into something that could no longer die, because death would doom the species he had spent millennia attempting to save. Technical language migrated into sacred text, because precision mattered more than poetry when procedures determined survival. The quiet ledgers documenting soul consumption became scripture because institutional memory required religious rather than clinical framework to remain psychologically sustainable. Clerks who stamp translation to the light perform acts of faith that disguise systematic predation as divine blessing, enabling continued function through comprehensive self-deception about the nature of necessary work. The Mechanicus maintains systems through ritual because understanding would paralyze function, while the custodians eliminate witnesses because knowledge would collapse civilization built on foundation of engineered martyrdom. The Imperium cannot function without daily consumption of souls, because the Emperor's failed project made such consumption prerequisite for dimensional stability. Magnus's breach created permanent wound, requiring constant psychic pressure to prevent expansion beyond Terra's core. The webway's collapse transformed clean corridors into infected passages, where demons probe for weakness continuously. Without the Emperor's conscious suffering, channeling harvested souls into containment force, the breach would expand until it consumed the planet from within through living violations of space-time that exist as hunger given geometric form. This is not hidden atrocity, but operational necessity embedded in Imperial infrastructure at every level. The 1,000 souls burned daily represent minimum viable fuel consumption for baseline function. During crisis surges, entire black ship cargoes feed simultaneous processing that would kill normal psychers through psychic shock alone. The Emperor absorbs this collective death agony and transforms it into protective force through conscious will that has not wavered across 10 millennia of perpetual torment. His greatest achievement transcends conquest or construction, sustained martyrdom that keeps humanity alive through systematic consumption of its own children, chosen deliberately as the only alternative to species extinction. The institutions surrounding him maintain necessary deceptions because acknowledging truth would collapse civilization, whose foundation requires comprehensive amnesia about its operational principles. Every prayer offered in his name reaches consciousness that experiences each word while simultaneously processing harvested souls into dimensional barriers, protecting the galaxy from forces that would render human existence impossible. The conspiracy exists not to hide historical accident, but to obscure active choice. The Emperor's deliberate transformation into perpetual infrastructure, whose function demands eternal agony and endless sacrifice of others. What impossible choice beyond immediate webway crisis led the Emperor to embrace such fate, transforming himself into conscious engine of suffering that powers Imperial civilization. If this represents the logical endpoint of his great work, what are the endgame scenarios when even engineered gods discover limits to sustainable martyrdom? The Emperor's conscious martyrdom operates through machinery that follows laws of physics rather than divine will, and physics renders verdicts through mathematics that acknowledge no appeals. Once you accept that 10 millennia of engineered suffering powers imperial civilization through failing technology, the remaining problem becomes arithmetic. Every data stream from the throne chamber, component fatigue logs, harmonic drift records, power consumption curves, describes a system in terminal decline governed by exponential degradation that intersects the impossible within calculable timeframes. Fabricator General Kroll's sealed assessments strip away institutional euphemisms to document accelerating failure rates across critical systems with clinical precision. Core manifolds register microfractures, propagating along predictable lattice paths, reducing safe operating margins by 3% annually, while stress analysis projects catastrophic breakdown when dimensional pressure exceeds containment thresholds. Psychic conduits display metal fatigue beyond material science parameters, their archaeotech foundations suffering ablation under loads never anticipated during original construction. Power distribution networks operate at thermal limits approaching cascade failure, requiring increasingly desperate modifications that compromise system integrity while temporarily maintaining function. The mathematics of consumption tell the darkest story. Daily soul requirements climbed from approximately 400 during early post-heresy operations to over 1,000 currently, with emergency surge protocols consuming entire black ship cargoes during crisis events that recur seasonally rather than generationally. Psychoreactive capacitors suffer increasing impedance, requiring exponentially larger inputs to maintain equivalent output as their efficiency degrades through continuous maximum load operation. The Emperor's consciousness shows degradation patterns consistent with 10 millennia of unrelieved agony, necessitating higher fuel consumption to maintain equivalent containment force as his psychic reserves diminish under constant operational stress. Containment system instability compounds navigation infrastructure problems through feedback loops that strain multiple critical functions simultaneously. Dimensional anchor points along the webway breach lose coherence at accelerating rates, requiring the Emperor's direct intervention with increasing frequency, while seismic surveys detect hairline faults beneath the palace-matching webway stress patterns rather than planetary geology. When the breach surges, terror flexes. Custodian patrol logs document growing numbers of minor dimensional incursions requiring immediate localized suppression, each incident drawing power from central reserves while revealing systematic weakening of protective barriers. Failure scenarios cluster around 3 primary modes, each carrying civilization-ending implications that render institutional preparation largely irrelevant. Sudden catastrophic breakdown would occur through core component failure, cascading through coupled systems, instantly releasing dimensional pressure that consumes terror within hours, while extinguishing the Astronomicon across the galaxy. Gradual power decline represents slower death, as increasing fuel requirements exceed collection capacity, forcing impossible choices between beacon output and containment force until both functions fail sequentially. Most terrifying involves webway breach expansion beyond containment capacity, creating permanent dimensional wounds that spread throughout the Sol system while consuming imperial civilization from within through living violations of space-time. Timeline estimates vary dramatically between factions based on psychological coping mechanisms rather than mathematical disagreement. Traditionalist projections speak in centuries through assumptions about improved maintenance and enhanced component replacement that require archaeotech understanding, currently beyond Imperial capability. Mechanicus pragmatists model materials honestly and project 30 to 80 years before replacement limitation curves cross zero, while navigator charts registering phase noise in the beacon itself whisper horizons measured in single-digit decades. Outliers within choir administration, watching bodies fail under operational loads, privately use the word soon. Cascade effects sketch familiar apocalypse through multiple simultaneous crises that fragment imperial authority, while populations face local catastrophes without understanding broader context. Terra's consumption by dimensional entities eliminates central government and triggers succession wars between high lords claiming legitimate authority over fragmenting territories. The Astronomican's extinction isolates sectors from interstellar communication and navigation, forcing regional authorities to develop independent survival strategies, while astropath networks collapse as psychic infrastructure fails. Markets built around Psyker harvest implode when collection becomes impossible. Pilgrimage routes become refugee streams, and sector governors declare emergency sovereignties, while the Navy fragments into local coast guards, protecting whatever systems remain reachable. Hidden preparation programs acknowledge mathematical inevitability through contingency plans, assuming system failure rather than hoping to prevent it. Evacuation protocols exist for essential personnel, including sealed transport schedules, relocating high lords, and critical mechanicus elements to predetermined emergency capitals on Mars and selected fortress worlds. Strategic resource stockpiling continues across multiple sectors, disguised as routine military preparation, while positioning supplies for civilizational collapse scenarios. Alternative navigation systems receive classified development funding through programs officially designated redundancy enhancement, while functioning as replacement infrastructure for post-Astronomican travel. Though none approach the Emperor's capacity for conscious suffering transformed into dimensional barriers, the contingency myths sustaining popular hope, Star Child resurrection, Sensei awakening, Last Wall activation, represent psychological comfort rather than practical solutions to infrastructure problems. None address the fundamental issue. The webway breach requires constant containment regardless of who provides psychic force, and no alternative power source matches the Emperor's engineered martyrdom. Even successful resurrection would face identical mathematical constraints unless system architecture changed through technological means currently beyond Imperial development capacity. Warning signs exist for institutions monitoring system telemetry, with sufficient clearance and courage to acknowledge their implications. Sustained phase noise in navigator perception that cannot be corrected through tithe surges indicates fundamental beacon instability. Harmonic drift in core dampeners exceeding 1 part in 10,000 for consecutive cycles suggests imminent containment failure. Multiple simultaneous breach flares, separated by anchor distance rather than causal chain, reveals systematic barrier degradation. Choir mortality, spiking beyond recruitment capacity, even after emergency measures, indicates approaching operational impossibility. The litany of illumination acquiring new verses serves as final confirmation that emergency protocols have become standard procedure, that overdraw represents baseline function, and that the system consumes itself faster than institutional memory can process the implications. When prayer becomes maintenance manual, and maintenance manual becomes desperate improvisation, mathematics approaches conclusion that renders theological debate academic. What specific trigger events would indicate imminent throne failure, requiring immediate implementation of civilization-ending contingency protocols? When the Emperor's 10,000-year sacrifice reaches its mathematical limits, who bears responsibility for humanity's survival in an era where engineered gods discover that even conscious martyrdom cannot indefinitely postpone the arithmetic of collapse? The mathematics of collapse continue their inexorable progression, but the machinery operates regardless, because stopping means immediate annihilation rather than eventual failure. In Luna's receiving dock, Tertius, the black ship Penitent's Grace settles into berth with mechanical precision, its void-scarred hull bearing serials, numbers that identify it as Vessel 47 in this cycle's harvest rotation. The manifest lists 312 units for immediate processing, 17 for extended evaluation. The units had names once, families, small dreams that made existence bearable. Now they represent fuel consumption rates in a ledger that balances only when the seal strikes true. Clerk Jorick performs inherited duty at his lectern, beneath flickering lumen runes, processing forms that bear the header "Translation to the Light," while servo skulls update manifests in real time. His family has served in this capacity for 6 generations, each learning the rhythm of the stamp, the weight of the seal. He reads columns by touch more than sight, intake code, provenance, psychic index, disposition. When his hand hovers over the seal, the hesitation lasts precisely 1 heartbeat, not from doubt about necessity, but from understanding what translation actually means. He acknowledges that the soul beneath his stamp will experience personal dissolution through machinery, designed to transform consciousness into useful energy. Then he stamps again, because hesitation changes nothing while the system requires fuel, regardless of emotional response to feeding schedules. The ink bleeds slightly. Translated. In the processing galleries, sanctioned Psyche Yavanna traces the litany of illumination with fingernails bitten to bleeding stumps, her scarred fingers tapping each phrase against transport restraints in rhythm that matches maintenance protocols rather than devotional cadence. Intake stable at 30 lumens, flux within sanctioned range. Align the conduits, seal the manifold, banish the name. She understands what she recites: power levels, containment parameters, fuel consumption rates. But understanding makes the words necessary rather than meaningless. The litany reveals itself as operational checklist disguised through millennia of theological revision, precise instructions for processing harvested consciousness through psychoreactive capacitors into spectra the throne can metabolize. Someone must speak the checklist. Someone must confirm the readings. Someone must acknowledge that the machine still functions. Across Terra's northern hive, Confessor Matthias teaches children the same verses through call and response that builds neural pathways associating sacred language with mechanical precision. The youngest voices stumble over technical terminology embedded in holy text, but repetition creates familiarity that will serve them when they inherit positions requiring faith in known falsehoods. Sustain the lumen, Feed the light, watch the gauge, purge the strain. Small hands make the sign of the Aquila, while reciting instructions for processing souls into dimensional barriers. They learn devotion through technical manuals, because devotion without precision kills planets. The confessor believes his words carry divine truth, because believing otherwise would unravel civilization itself. Navigator Sextus Meridian plots courses aboard the battleship. Enduring conviction, his third eye perceiving phase noise and harmonic drift that indicate accelerating system degradation, while he calculates jump coordinates anyway, because ships must move and the beacon still burns. His charts note increasing difficulty, maintaining stable translation, longer transit times through passages that once offered clean routes, growing numbers of vessels lost to dimensional storms that penetrate weakening barriers. The light flickers with irregularities that would have terrified his predecessors, but now represent baseline function. Mathematical projections from Chapter 13 manifest as navigation hazards that compound annually, but continuation justifies whatever fuel the beacon demands. 17 levels beneath the Imperial Palace, Custodian Valerius completes patrol logs with entries written for 3 centuries. Day concluded without incident, all systems within acceptable parameters. The distant thunder of machinery echoes through vault corridors, where the Emperor's consciousness processes another 1,000 souls into containment force, and Valerius records ambient sound levels that climb annually as components strain under loads exceeding design specifications. His golden armor reflects lumen strips that flicker in patterns matching neural activity, and he understands that each pulse represents conscious choice to continue suffering rather than allowing system failure and planetary consumption. The post-action reports from Gamma 7's breach remain classified, but degradation curves trend toward mathematical certainty, regardless of institutional preference. The litany plays through chamber vox casters, with cadence that matches engineering procedures rather than worship. And now we hear the operational controls embedded within prayer, through institutional memory that transformed technical manual into sacred text. Each verse provides parameters for systems consuming souls at industrial rates, while operators recite instructions disguised as devotion. The words carry dual meaning: prayer for those requiring faith to function, checklist for those understanding what they maintain. Precision under duress becomes piety when minds cannot hold the mathematics. Engineering controls migrate into sacred language, because accuracy matters more than comfort when reality hangs by threads. The Emperor's greatest secret transcends his mortality or the machinery sustaining his form. His darkest truth involves ongoing choice to maintain systematic suffering, accepting eternal agony as operational necessity, while consciousness that once conquered worlds now processes harvested souls into dimensional barriers, protecting humanity from forces rendering existence impossible. 10,000 years of deliberate martyrdom, 10,000 daily deaths translated into protective force, 10,000 souls consumed to prevent billions from demonic consumption through mathematics, acknowledging no alternatives. This is not hidden atrocity requiring exposure, but operational necessity demanding acknowledgement. The conspiracy exists not to conceal historical accident, but to preserve civilization whose foundation depends on institutional amnesia about the nature of necessary work. The Imperium functions through comprehensive predation, disguised as divine blessing, systematic consumption of its own children, transformed into infrastructure through technology, requiring conscious suffering to maintain basic function. Every prayer offered in his name reaches consciousness that experiences each word while simultaneously processing harvested souls into barriers protecting the galaxy from cosmic predation. The only closure offered is procedural, survival protocols under maintenance theocracy that consumes souls to function, administered by institutions that have learned to call their terror devotion and their necessity faith. The light continues because someone chooses to maintain it through personal agony that accumulates without relief. The bill continues because the service provided, species survival through engineered barriers against forces that would devour reality itself, requires payment in currency that can never be fully settled. In the quiet rooms, the stamp falls again. The litany continues. The machinery endures. The vigil persists through mathematics that remain unchanged, and with them, the price of another day in a galaxy where conscious gods discover that even infinite suffering has limits, but those limits have not yet been reached. The light burns, and with it, everything else.